All right, we go now to Dr. Paul Kengor, professor of political science at Grove City College. Paul, great to have you back on. You just wrote a piece about Henry Kissinger for the National Catholic Register. In it, you say he was a legend in foreign policy, whether you feel that impact as positive or negative, for better or for worse. Talk to us more about that.
Yeah, it's really true. In fact, those two packages that you just played, I mean, he was reviled by a lot of people. I mean, I guess loathed and loved. I mean, people felt that he was terrible in Vietnam, good on Vietnam. I mean, among the things he did in Vietnam. So yeah, he wanted to increase weapons there because he and Richard Nixon wanted us to withdraw from honor, as they put it. So they felt that we didn't lose on the ground in Vietnam. So they felt that it shouldn't look like we were retreating once we were leaving. We wanted to leave. We wanted to get out of there, but we weren't defeated. So the key was to retreat with honor in a way that looked like that we weren't defeated, because we weren't. So, I mean, it was that kind of nuanced, very skillful work that he did in foreign policy, on China, so many other issues. I mean, Richard Nixon is known as this president who was like a kind of a foreign policy genius as a president, and the guy behind him in many respects was Henry Kissinger. He was definitely one of the most influential voices in foreign policy, I'd say, Tracy, not just in the 20th century or even the 1970s, but really in the history of America.
Yeah, and Paul, I want to talk about this now, his connection to the Catholic Church and his relationship with multiple popes. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and here's where I'll level a criticism. Okay, so I think what Kissinger pursued with Richard Nixon, with Nixon's successor Gerald Ford, those are two Republicans, and then following that came Jimmy Carter, who was a Democrat. All of those 1970s presidents, they pursued this idea of détente with the Soviets, and the idea was, we need to learn to get along with the Soviets. They're going to be around forever. We should trade with them. We should have treaties with them. We should lessen the likelihood of nuclear war. And unfortunately, that means that we need to accept the so-called détente status quo in Eastern Europe, which means that you cede Eastern Europe to this so-called Soviet sphere of influence. And this was the kind of realpolitik, Machiavellian sort of posturing that Kissinger and Nixon and Gerald Ford and also even Jimmy Carter did in foreign policy. Now, the guys who changed this were Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II. And I should add, Pope Paul VI, who was Pope while Kissinger was in office in the 1970s, he also pursued this sort of détente. It was called Ostpolitik when he did it. So Nixon and Paul VI were together on this détente Ostpolitik, kind of accommodating the Soviets. Well, then later come Reagan and John Paul II, and they said, no, that's wrong. That's immoral, because it puts all these people behind the Iron Curtain under the jackboot of Soviet communism. We should be liberating those people. We should be rolling back communism. We should be defeating communism, not in an aggressive way, not with nuclear war, but peacefully. And that was the breakthrough, the break from Kissinger, Nixon policy in the 70s to even Reagan and John Paul II in the 1980s. And the latter policy won the Cold War.
We have about a minute left, Paul. But quickly, what do you think his legacy will be?
Well, that's a good question. I'd say, along with Nixon opening China to the West, and just overall being this constant presence on the scene for, I mean, almost 50 years, right? No, I mean, more than 50 years, going back to 1969. And at one point, Tracy, I mean, he was both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Now, in most administrations, those two positions are pitted against one another, but Kissinger actually had both positions. So he was a very powerful man, a very powerful as well as thoughtful foreign policy voice.
Yeah, he certainly was. Dr. Paul Kengor, always great to be with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Sure thing. Thanks, Tracy.